Well, again, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. I hope you enjoyed your week off from the class. But now we are starting again. So get ready for, I hope you brought your Kleenex box for the
We're back
nosebleeds
to the
today.
future.
But I'd like to, like I said, go back and I want to review a few things with you in regards to we'll go back and look a little bit at the structural diagramming and then continue on from there. Probably the next couple of weeks, we'll review the diagramming a little bit and hopefully can remember some of the things we covered before. And I thought what I do is maybe go back to some basic steps. I'll show you what I mean as we go through this. Again, our focus today will be back on the structural diagram. And what I wanted to do was, of course, you know, you've seen this. This is sort of, I'm going to use Philemon as an example for us, but this is what we're after when we talk about a structural diagram or a block diagram, right? It's where we've broken up a sentence, a paragraph, into each of its phrases and its clauses. And so here you have that, and it's a visual representation of how each phrase and clause works within the sentence. What is it connected to? What is it modifying? So again, for example, in this verse, Philemon verses 4 and 5, which is, I thank my God always when I remember you in my prayers, because I hear of your love and of the faith that you have toward the Lord Jesus and for all the saints. And so this particular sentence in Philemon, we have when I remember you is indented under the word thank, because that shows us visually that this particular group of words, when I remember you, is modifying thank. And over here on the right, I tell you it's when I think. So it's describing when I thank my God. And so this diagram, as we've looked at in the past, gives us sort of a visual picture of the relationship between these phrases and clauses. Now, what I wanted to do was sort of step back and maybe look at this from a little different a different way than we have before, because I think it might be helpful for some of you, because I know this diagramming still is a challenge. All right, so let's just remind ourselves how you know, how and I'm looking at an epistle here. Of course, this could apply to a poem. It could apply to parts of narrative, but we'll just step back and look at epistles, because that's where diagramming is really the most helpful tool we can use. And when it comes to an epistle, again, remember, an epistle is a letter that's made up of paragraphs. All right. And each paragraph is connected together. Each paragraph represents a unit of thought. If I was talking to you about poetry, which is our next module, I would be saying a poem is made up of stanzas, and each stanza represents a unit of thought. And each unit of thought is placed one after the other to form a flow of thought. And that gives us the point of the poem, or the point of the main message of the epistle. And so each of these, no, I didn't line this up correctly. Somehow it got messed up in the, this is what it should be. And then a paragraph. All right, give me a minute here, guys, to make this a little easier to. And a paragraph is, you can see here I've represented visually as a, it's broken up into sentences. Okay. So again, you have an epistle, it's broken up into paragraphs, and then each paragraph can be broken up into one or more sentences. And then each of those sentences can be broken into a series of phrases or clauses. All right. And so this just kind of shows that how we can break down each part. I'll just show you an example of that from Philemon. All right. This is the whole letter of Philemon, or at least as much as I can fit on your screen there. All right. And notice what I've done here is I've broken up Philemon into its paragraphs. Okay, I'm not gonna read through the whole thing, but you can understand, I think, the concept, right? So Philemon, the first paragraph is the introduction in verses 1 and 2. The second paragraph in Philemon is Paul's prayer for Philemon. The third paragraph is Paul's request to Philemon. The fourth paragraph is an additional request or emphasis, encouragement to Philemon. And then the fifth paragraph is the concluding remarks and personal remarks. But here you can see the whole letter to Philemon, the whole epistle is broken down into each of its paragraphs, right? Now, if we were to take each of those paragraphs, we could break each of those paragraphs down into one or more sentences. For example, let me take paragraph number 2, for example, verses 4 to 7. If I were to break that up, here's verses 4 to 7, and we see it's broken up. We could break it up into 3 sentences. Okay, sentence number 1 is verses 4 and 5. Sentence number 2 is verses 6 and verse 6, and then sentence number 3 is verse 7. Okay, all I'm doing here is showing you this idea, and I'm showing it to you by an example. All right, we're an epistle is broken up into paragraphs. Each paragraph can be broken up into one or more sentences, and each sentence is made up of clauses and phrases. All right, and so here we have Philemon's paragraphs. Each paragraph can be broken up into its sentences, and then each sentence, and I just took the first sentence, verses 4 and 5, each sentence can then be broken up into its phrases and clauses. Okay, and that's what I've done here. Just show you an example. This is the first sentence from Philemon, verses 4 to 7, and this sentence is verse 4 and verse 5, and all I've done is highlighted each phrase and or clause in a different color, just so you could see it. All right, and notice in this particular sentence we have 1, 2, 3 clauses and 1, 2, 3, 4 phrases. Okay, so this is the process we've been doing, is identifying phrases and clauses, and I'm just trying to remind you those phrases and clauses are what build a sentence, and then one or more sentences are what build a paragraph, and then a series of paragraphs is what builds an epistle. All right, now, so then the block diagram again would look something like this once you're done. Now, what I want to do is sort of go one step further. All right, we've looked at epistles can be broken down into paragraphs. Each paragraph can be broken down into one or more sentences that make up that paragraph, and then each sentence can be broken down into at least one clause and then one or more additional phrases or clauses. All right, now there's one more step, one more. We can break it down even further. All right, and that is we can break down each clause into these 4 different kinds of parts of speech. All right, and this is where Sir Sid is going to enjoy this part, I think, very much. All right, he loves this stuff. So this lecture this morning is dedicated to Sir Sid. All right, but notice here each clause, and I could put here also each phrase, they're made up of a smaller component, and that is nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Those are the 4 basic types of parts of speech that make up a clause or a phrase. Okay, and again, we take those nouns, verbs, and adjectives and adverbs that makes up a clause or a phrase, and then we put those together, clauses and phrases, to make up a sentence, and then we put sentences together to make up a paragraph. And again, each paragraph represents a unit of thought, and put together with other paragraphs then build the epistle. All right. And I could do the same thing for poems. There's clauses and phrases in poetry, and those are made up of nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Each clause or phrase in a poem makes up a sentence, and then sentences are put together to make up stanzas, and then stanzas form the poem as a whole. All right. So what I want to do is we're going to start back down at the basics. We're going to start here with the clause and just review and remind ourselves of these 4 key building blocks. Okay. And then I think that will help then as we go up to the next level, which is the sentence level, and then talk about how these phrases and clauses connect together. Okay. So for some of you, this will be very basic review. For others of you, this might be something that might help answer some questions that you may have been having in our discussions. And I think it will help going forward as well. All right. So are there any questions so far? Does this? Okay, I'm just trying to. Yeah, Bobby?
Pastor Tim? Yeah. I was just going to make a comment.
Yes.
Uh, 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 per my experience, um, most of the time I am challenged, most especially when uh, the paragraph begins with clauses and phrases. Mm. So, in my personal experience, my challenge is to identify the main sentence of every paragraph. Of course, I don't know with the others, but most of the time those are my main challenges to identify the main sentence. So it takes a while for me to identify the main sentences.
Yeah, and because each paragraph is made up of 1 or more sentences, and so how do you identify within that what is the main verb and subject, right? How do
Yeah,
I know?
correct.
Yes. So I'm going to give you some. We're going to do some exercises together today and next week that I'm hoping will help that a little bit. Just as you look at a paragraph, how do you break it down? And so we'll see if this works. I've just been trying to think of some other ways to help make this a little clearer. Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks for that comment.
But Pastor Tim, I don't mean to divert you with our lesson today. Okay.
That's that's something I'm intending to try to help with as we move forward in the next couple of weeks. Any other questions or comments that you guys have so far?
Pastor Tim.
Yes.
This review that you're doing right now with us is really helpful. You've made it clear to us already, but still it's a challenge to us. And I think it will continue to be a challenge to us. Every time we look at a paragraph or read the epistles and look at its paragraphs and diagram it, I think it will be, it is a part already of our work as pastors or expositors. But the thing is, this concept, no, this diagramming, when applied to the narratives, it's more difficult. And so, if you can show us an example of how to diagram a narrative, I think it will, at least in my case, it will help me. I don't know with others.
Yes, certainly. I think part of with narratives that you need to be able to do is identify within the narrative what parts of it would be useful to diagram, because it's not helpful to diagram the whole narrative, but it can be helpful to diagram certain parts. Okay. And so certainly the epistles, diagramming is a vital step in interpreting an epistle, a passage from an epistle. Diagramming also can be very helpful in as you're studying a poem, because both of those by their nature are didactic, they're instructional. You know, an epistle is written to be an instruction, right? That's the whole purpose. And a poem is the same. Poems aren't written in order to give instruction or to express a thought. And so they are also structured in a way that diagramming can help. Now, a poem has other features that we're going to look at in the next module that are important to understand, as far as its structure, as far as the figurative language and the imagery. But still at the heart of poetry is this idea of communicating a concept through the each stanza. Now, and it's the same for sermons. If you look in like prophetic literature, or you look even in the Gospels when there are sermons, sermons are didactic, they are instructional. And so sermons also are very helpful to diagram, because again, if it's an instructional passage, then there's going to be a certain logical flow and connection of the words and phrases and clauses that diagramming will help you to identify those connections. Now with narrative, right, as we've had studied and as you've preached on, narrative they're constructed together differently. They're constructed together as a story with various scenes. And so diagramming is a little different. Now, sometimes within a story, you'll have instructional components to it. Like, for example, if you're in the Gospels and Jesus is giving instruction, well, that's going to be a part you're going to want to diagram. Now, but if it's just telling the story, you know, like in Jonah, right? That Jonah went to the Ninevites and Jonah preached this message, and then the Ninevite, you know, it's just telling the story. Diagramming is not going to be helpful, because in storytelling, it's not written with an instructive flow. The instruction is in the point of the story. All right. It's not. So you have to let the story be developed, and then at the end you get the instructional point from the author once you see the plot of the story. But it's not, the genre is such that it's not put together in the same way like an epistle or a poem, because it's not like each and every verse is instructional in a narrative. Each and every verse is building upon a scene. And that scene then put together with other scenes gives us the plot of the story. And from the plot, we get the point of the story. But within the story, like, for example, we can go back to, let's go back to John 4. Well, we studied this at one time in our lives. It seems like a long time since we've done that. Of course, you remember this was the story of the woman at the well. And now there are parts within this account where the dialogue here, the first few verses, verse 7, 8, and 9, it's just telling the story. And Jesus is beginning an interaction with her. He says something, then she says something, he says something back. But really, it's a dialogue right now. So diagramming this is not really going to give you much helpful information. But when you get to, say, for example, verse 21 through 24, here, Jesus is giving instruction on worship. So this part, these 4 verses would be very useful to diagram, because it's instructional in its nature. He's teaching. Okay? So as a result, then, I would diagram these 4 verses in particular. All right. But after that, right, then it's the woman said to him this, Jesus said, it's a dialogue. The disciples come. It's still dialogue. So all these verses, verse 25 to 33, is just dialogue back and forth. Again, don't need to diagram that. It's not going to give you much helpful information. But when we get to verse 34, notice again, Jesus gives more instruction. I would diagram verses 34 to 38 because, again, it's an instructional form that Jesus is presenting. He's teaching something. And so whenever you have that kind of a form like of teaching, diagramming will help. Okay, because there's a certain outline, there's a point that he's making, and it's helpful to see how the various phrases and clauses connect together. All right.
Yeah. Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
can I comment again?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And yeah, as in my experience, my tendencies are because before Thea, I got used to reading the Bible from a devotional approach. So I developed this tendency to look at all the details and find something there. That it became an inclination to me until Thea, where now I am being taught to be more objective, So that's why whenever I approach narrative, I get to see details, and try to pursue all of them, and try to give to look into the details of all of them. So now, with the instruction on narrative, I am learning to become a little more specific of what I need to focus on. So that's what one of my insights now. Yes, Pastor Tim.
Good. Yeah, you can kind of think of it like when you're dealing with a story, is you've got sort of a couple of layers. You've got the story itself, okay, which we have looked at and studied, and you take that story and you say, okay, I need to understand the plot of this story so that I can understand its point. The author obviously had a point in giving this story. And so I need to study the story, identify the introduction, the problem, the rising action, the climax, the resolution, falling action, because that tells me that's part of how the story is being told. And as I understand that, I can see what the point of the story is that I, the reader, am supposed to learn. Now, within that story, you'll have pieces within the story that are the author uses in order to help us understand the point of each scene in the story. And sometimes within that, there'll be these instructional sections or verses. For example, if you're studying, if we go to, let's go to a well-known instructional passage in the gospel. But first, right, we remember in Matthew's gospel that hopefully you guys can see here, right? Matthew goes through and he starts with the genealogy, and then he goes through the birth account with Mary and Joseph, and then he goes through, starts in chapter 3, begins John the Baptist. He introduces John the Baptist to us, and then Jesus's baptism in chapter 3. This is all narrative stories. He's giving us accounts that he's putting together in order to express a point. There's a point to his whole gospel, and then there's also a point to each of these particular stories within the gospel. We get to chapter 4, the temptation. All right. And then comes chapter 5. The disciples are called. Then comes chapter 5. He's in Galilee. Now we have the Sermon on the Mount. So far, if I'm studying Matthew chapters 1 through 4, my focus is going to be on looking at each of the scenes that Matthew gives and trying to understand, okay, how does this scene fit into the purpose of his gospel? But then also, how do each of these smaller stories connect together? And is there a particular point in each of these accounts, like the baptism account? What is Matthew trying to teach us there? Then the temptation of Christ. He obviously includes those events in chapter 4 of Matthew because he wants us to understand and learn something from them. All right. And then we get to chapter 5, and it's the Sermon on the Mount, which is instructional from Jesus, right? 3 chapters, chapter 5, chapter 6,
Chapter 6 and
chapter 7, right? Up till verse 27, right? And then when Jesus had finished, the crowds were amazed. So this whole sermon, one, in the context of Matthew intends to show us how Jesus taught with authority and how he taught. Okay? And that's part of the bigger picture of the Gospel of Matthew, as Matthew is trying to demonstrate this Jesus is, in fact, the King of the Jews. And he wasn't like anybody else. He was like a prophet, he was like a king, and he taught with authority. Okay, so the Sermon on the Mount fits into the whole book in that way, but also from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives specific instruction of what a kingdom citizen looks like. All right, Matthew's trying to show us this is the king has come. In chapters 5 through 7, it is the message of the king on what it looks like to be a citizen of his kingdom. And within it, the Sermon on the Mount, it's all instructional. So it's almost like an epistle in a lot of ways, right? Because it is a sermon, it is didactic, and you can break it down like you would an epistle. And so diagramming becomes a very important tool when you're studying the Sermon on the Mount. All right? But you need to understand that Sermon on the Mount was given as part of a larger narrative. So I have to understand narrative and how that works to know why Matthew put the Sermon on the Mount there where he did and how it fits the story. But then also, as I'm studying the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus taught there, I'm going to be also using, like I said, diagramming as one tool in breaking down, understanding what Jesus was saying. Okay? So I don't know if that made things more confusing or if that helped answer what you were asking, Alan. Does that clarify anything, or do you have...
Yes, it helped me a lot, Pastor Tim. Thank you.
Okay.
Now, my conclusion is because I was assigned the passage of Jonah chapter 3.
Yes.
And it's plain narrative. As far as I see it, there's nothing there that I can say instructional. There's nothing there in chapter 3. It's just plain narrative. So the way you explained it, I've come to realize that the point of the narrative is to convey a particular point. The author wants to communicate a point. So it's like, for me, if I will diagram it, I will just focus on the point. Is that what you meant, Pastor Tim? Focus on the point and see how, in the case of my assignment, see how the author highlights his point or emphasizes his point through the punchlines of the story. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I understand it right now. Just focus on the main point and see how the whole narrative, how it flows, in that particular passage or section, and just observe carefully and do the diagramming. That's how I understand it now.
Yeah, because if you look at chapter 3, this is the narrator. Verses 1 to 4 is just the narrator telling the story, and then verses 5 through 9, or actually 5 and 6, again the narrators continuing. Verse 7 through 9 is just the dialogue from the king. So verses 1 to 9 is just part of the story. So there's nothing really to diagram there, because there's no intentional instructional part to this. Now maybe verse 10, which is a key verse in chapter 3, that might be something to consider diagramming, because it is a comment by the narrator, but it's sort of a summary comment from this part of the book of Jonah. What I wanted to see for you guys, if you could, as you preach through your Jonah passages, or Ruth, the same would apply to Ruth, is if you were able to understand how your particular chapter fit within the whole story. Some of you tended to just focus on your chapter without considering how your chapter connected to the rest of the story. And so I think, particularly in all of the chapters, but for example, in Jonah 1, understanding how does this story chapter fit within the whole book? And certainly it introduces Jonah and introduces him disobeying and going the other way and all of that. But you have to ask yourself, if you know the purpose of the book of Jonah, it's not about Jonah's disobedience, right? There's an attribute of God that is the particular focus of this book. And so Jonah's trying to thwart the Lord's work all the way through. And so in chapter 1, you have to understand, how does that chapter fit within the purpose and theme of this book? And that's when your attention will draw more to the sailors and what happened to them. And it's the same here in chapter 3. The focus here is not Jonah and, oh, now he's obeying. Well, is he? Right? Instead of going 3 days through the city, like the narrator says, it's a 3 days walk, Jonah just spent 1 day going through the city. All right. And then, of course, you have to know chapter 4 to understand chapter 3. And chapter 4, Jonah still hasn't repented because his attitude is still wrong. So then you have to ask, okay, if Jonah's not God's the primary character, God is showing something about himself in this book. Jonah has the opposite attitude. Chapter 3, then, attention isn't on Jonah so much as the Ninevites and God. Just like chapter 1, it's not so much about Jonah, but about God and those sailors.
So
now, chapter 4, 1 second. Chapter 4 is about God and Jonah. Jonah becomes more central in chapter 4 because God's dealing with him. Yeah, Alan?
Okay, thank you, Pastor Tim. Now I just want to say that how I outline my preaching, my outline for Jonah chapter 3 focuses on, number 1, Jonah's response, number 2, the Ninevites' response, and number 3, God's response. Those are the 3 points of my outline. Jonah's response to God, the Ninevites' response to God, and God's response to the preaching of Jonah and the response of the Ninevites.
Yeah, and that breaks up the scenes very well, because verses 1 to 4 is Jonah's response. What does he do? verses 5 through 9, the people's response, especially the king. And then verse 10, God's response. So that breaks up the story very well. The key will be, can you identify that you don't have to make a spiritual or doctrinal or theological point with each one of those? Okay. And here's where narrative preaching is different than epistle and even poetry preaching. Narrative preaching, you don't have to be compelled to make a theological point from each scene. Okay? Because often the theological point is actually all the scenes combined, what the story tells. And so in narrative preaching, it's not so, each of our outline points is really each of the scenes, and we're just explaining the story, adding understanding. For example, in Jonah 3, you're going to want to mention, okay, what is this sackcloth and ashes? What's that all about? And helping your people understand what that means, pointing out little features like, okay, Jonah goes to Nineveh. Now, how far away is Nineveh? We got to remember this, right? It's over 3 months journey to get from the coast of the Mediterranean to Nineveh. That's a long way. All right. And so you need to help sort of add. So Jonah goes on this long journey. Did that actually, did he have a change of heart when he got there? Well, what's interesting is notice that when Jonah got there, the author tells us that the city of Nineveh was 3 days walk. How long did Jonah take? He only spent a day there. Why is that? Now, I wouldn't answer that question yet. I just kind of throw that in as something to think about. And let's look at Jonah's message. So in the first 4 verses, you're just kind of explaining what took place and adding, understanding to certain parts of it. But you don't have to make it form a theological point, because that's not what the author's doing here. He's just telling the story. His theological point's coming later. Okay. And then verses 5 to 9, again, this, we see the characteristics of genuine repentance here. And certainly as you tell the story, you can talk about that as well, what genuine repentance looks like. All right. And just how they responded. You could talk about God's grace in that, and that these pagans actually showed a repentant heart. But again, you don't have to attach a theological point to it yet, because the author of the story was really just telling the story. The theological point comes in verse 10, because verse 10 is what connects to the theme of the whole book. All right? It's the same in chapter 1. I think verse 16 connects to the point of the whole book. Chapter 2, salvation is from the Lord. Verse 9 connects sort of to the theme of the book. All right? And so what you're trying to do is figure out how each of these chapters connect to the book as a whole. And this is what I'm saying with bigger narratives, it's still the same thing. How does this story, this particular chapter, or could be a few chapters, how is that part of the story as a whole? How does it link up to it? All right. And this is why it's hard. This is hard to do, because we're used to preaching like epistles. We're used to find the theological point, in every few verses, and then preach that theological point. And certainly there's a lot of doctrine that we can find in these various stories, but our primary objective is to preach the story and the point the author was wanting to communicate through the story, not find all the doctrinal links within the story. That can be done, as a follow-up message, or, if you want to preach the story of Jonah, then you can come back and talk about God's sovereignty from the book of Jonah, or talk about, true repentance, and things like that. But we want to first be faithful to the author's main point. So for Jonah 3, since your question was about diagramming, the only verse I would see that I think could be helpful to diagram might be verse 10. Because verses 1 to 9 is really just he's telling the story. There's nothing there to diagram that would, because none of it's instructional, didactic. It's all storytelling. Okay? Does that make sense, Alan? Or
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
so my encouragement and challenge to you guys is as you approach your New Testament story from John, is keeping in mind how that story that you have connects to John's purpose and what he's trying to teach through the whole book. All right, which again we know his purpose explicitly because he gives it to us in chapter 20. All right. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions? You guys still with me? You've all learned how to sleep with your eyes open, right? So I can't even tell if you're.
Who's sleeping? Who's sleeping? Come on now. You better confess. No, but Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
it's really challenging, you know. But we're me. I am grateful for all the inputs I am getting. You know, it makes me more flexible with my work and my responsibility in handling the word of God. You know,
Yeah.
for example, my in my situation, um, there it helps me a lot, Pastor Tim, from what you have been teaching us, is to be able to see the whole point of the author. And I think that's very important, to see the whole point of the author. For me, that's most significant to what you have been teaching us. You know, get the whole point of the author. Where he is he getting at? So that when I come to points where the Lord wants me to make emphasis of certain things. For example, the context of situation we are in, the context of the situation where the church is going through or experiencing, I can have more flexibility uh, to be able to use the scenes of the stories, the scene of the story, to be able to apply them to the need of the hour and the need of the situation without really getting away from the main point of the author. For me, that's most important, that uh, as the New Testament says, no, study yourself, approve unto God, a workman who does not need to be ashamed. And the challenge really for me, as I can see from my experiences, is to really stick to the main point. Mm. Try as much as possible not to go away to the main point of the author.
Yeah.
So that's Pastor Tim. That's what I'm getting from this study, from our learning here, to really um, have a good grasp of the narrative of the story. And then because uh, there are subjective situations that we find ourselves in, where we are confronted with the situation in the church, the situation of the people, and all of that. But and then it gives us greater flexibility to be able to use the word of God, those texts and those, you know. So that's just my comment, Pastor Tim. My
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate that. I think exactly what you said. storytelling is a challenge in itself, and is trying to convey what the author's trying to teach us. So as we've said many times, if God wanted the word to be preached as an epistle, then the whole Bible would be full of epistles, right? But it's not. So we have to learn how to adjust and present each part of Scripture in the way that it was presented to us. And it's hard to do with stories, but yeah, you can't tell one part of a story unless you understand all of it, at least to an extent. So that's what I gave you, these Jonah and Ruth passages, because I really wanted to see if you guys could, convey how your story fit, how the chapter you had fit with the whole, theme of the book, and how does the author use that particular piece in the book. And so I think overall you guys did a good job, and I gave you some feedback on ways that you could work more at that. But I just wanted to give you that challenge and see how you would do. So it's going to be the same for books that are larger narratives. If you're looking at Genesis or Luke, or Kings. I mean, how does the story that you are teaching connect to what the whole point of the whole book is, and how does it fit in the place that it's been put? So yeah, so diagramming, I mean, is really a small component for interpreting stories. We sort of took the opportunity because of the difficulty of diagramming, and we didn't have the chance to go into a lot of detail in class when we covered it. So I just sort of took the opportunity with these workshop classes to go into more detail there. Maybe should have waited till module 3. I don't know, but I think that that diagram is going to serve us well more for epistles and poetry, and even for prophetic, a lot of the prophetic genre, because a lot of the prophetic genre is in the form of sermons. All the prophets preached, and so the prophetic books are really a collection of their sermons or parts of their sermons. So diagramming will help us there also. But narrative, it helps in certain places. But what the bigger thing is for narratives is just understanding how to interpret a story. So why don't we do this, given the time? Are there any more questions or comments on what we've been talking about? I don't want to.
Pastor Tim, could
Yes.
I also make some? I was about to write because I wanted to say this at the last portion of our class today. But since you asked, let me just ask you, and for the benefit of all of us, would it really be good for all of us to really study, have a study of Bible survey to look at the book again, an overview of the Bible, maybe just to complement our study on expository preaching, to complement it, because it just occurred to me that one of the key also is to really have a good grasp of the books, most especially the narratives. Okay, not the epistles anymore, just the narratives. To really have a survey of that might not even be something that we need to enroll on. It's just a good extra biblical material to help us, to refresh us with Bible survey, an overview of the book, and perhaps Pastor Tim, you could recommend to us what those resources would be, just to give us an overview, and the basic outlining of those narratives, the narrative portions.
Oh, so are you saying requesting like for us to do something like that together at
No,
some
no, no.
point?
I'm not requesting, just our extra work for
Oh, I
ourselves,
see.
just for us to complement our study of expository preaching, the lesson you are teaching us, and supplementary for us to do a little extra to study, maybe you can suggest resources of Bible survey or panorama study of those particular narrative books.
Yeah, I think probably the Talk Through the Bible is a very helpful resource.
Okay, talk through the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah, by Boa, Kenneth
Yeah,
Boa,
Kenneth
and
Boa. Yeah,
Bruce
Kenneth Boa.
Wilkinson. I've found the Survey of the Bible by William Hendrickson
Mm-hmm.
is also very helpful. The Bible Project videos on YouTube.
Yes, Bible Project videos.
Yeah.
The one that uses the illustration, Pastor Tim.
Yes. I have not looked at every single one of those, but I have looked at several of them. And especially the narratives, I found them to be helpful because they give the big picture of the book in a helpful way.
I looked at some of the epistles of those. Not, of course, I did not also see everything, but I looked at the epistles. Very helpful.
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, some of the books like Revelation, I did not. They take a different position on that book, and so I don't really. That one wasn't as helpful, but so there are maybe a few that I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but most of what I've seen from them is good. And then the drawing, sort of helps those of us who need to see it. I think that's a very strong feature from those. The MacArthur Study Bible does give sort of a brief overview of each book, but it's not. It's just brief, just a few pages. Those are ones that come to my mind off the top of my head.
So for the benefit of everybody, Walk Through the Bible by Kenneth Boa and
Bruce
Bruce
Wilkinson.
Wilkinson.
Yeah,
Bruce Wilkinson. And then the other one, Pastor Tim, you mentioned
it's called Survey of the Bible by William
Survey of the Bible
Hendrickson.
by William Hendrickson. Okay.
Yeah, that one's helpful.
And then Bible Project.
Bible Projects, good.
So that's
good
in
resource.
YouTube, no?
Yeah, that one's on YouTube, so you can look that one up.
And then the introduction of
the MacArthur Study Bible.
MacArthur Study Bible. And
yeah.
So Pastor Tim, the Bible software, for example, eSword, or the Bible softwares we are using, no? The introduction there will be very helpful also, no?
Yeah, I have not used much from eSword, so I couldn't comment.
Okay.
On that. So if you found them, if you use it, found it helpful, then
yeah. There's a book, Pastor Tim, background of every the background of every book. There's a literature like that, background of every book of the Bible.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you come across that? No.
Who's the author or publisher?
I was not able to get, but it's in a software. One of my Bible software is Parsons. No, it was bought already by Word Search, I think, but they have that book background of all the books of the Bible.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay. Mm.
If any more come to my mind, I'll give it some thought. Those are the
Yeah.
three things that. Okay, let me do this. In the time we have remaining, let me just review with you quickly the format for, let's see, where is it? I don't know. Oh, I got to pull it up. Give me a moment I'm going to pull up the format for the next assignment just to review that real quick and make sure if you have any questions. Let's see. Assignment. Here we go. Okay. Sorry, I need to open this file for you. Okay. Now I've got it. Okay. This is an example from the book of Luke here. But this is it's the same thing you did it's the same format that you used for your Old Testament passage. It's the background and literary context. And again, if you remember, every book, except Psalms, every book has a background context. In Psalms, the book doesn't have one, but each psalm does. But every book of the Bible, except Psalms, has a background context, meaning it was written by a particular author to a particular person or group of people at a particular time, in a particular situation, in a particular culture. And so the background context is the first step after you read through the book several times. It's the first step in the process of studying a particular passage. This is where, just as Pastor Bobby had mentioned a few minutes ago, understanding the book overall. And so the background context allows us, is a step that intends to help us try to figure that out. What is the book as a whole? Can we find the reason that the book was written, or can we find the purpose? What is the author trying to tell us? And so the background context is meant to help us uncover certain features of a book so that will help us answer that question. And so essentially it's just 3 steps that I want you to follow as you do this for the Gospel of John. All right, now I've given you a lot of, if you go back to session 1 in the workshop, you're going to get actually a lot of helpful information from the Gospel of John or on the Gospel of John from our discussion. So I gave you already actually quite a bit of input on the background of the Gospel of John. So you can go back there and get some helpful information. But basically the 3 steps for this assignment that I want you to follow are: first, to identify the background context by noting the writer, the recipients, key locations, when it was written, all of that. And you can do that just by, I've included the table here that has each of the categories I want you to collect information for, and then just the guiding questions. Now, you don't have to answer every question. These are just meant to give you some ideas of things to look for. Again, this is for the whole book of John. So you need to be reading through the whole book. I know it's a big book, but I gave you a little book for your Old Testament assignment. All right. You only had 4 chapters. So now that you're experts in narrative studying and preaching, I'm going to give you a bigger book. But I think John, most of us are familiar with John. So hopefully this won't be, I could have given you like First Chronicles or something, right? So it's being nice to you. but we'll just do John. And like I said, actually, a lot of this information we've already talked about. So if you go back and look at the lecture discussion and workshop at first or second session, you can get some of that information. But here, what I want you to do is just for each category, for author, recipients, social, meaning are there other people mentioned in the book? Historical is just at what time period was the book written? Geography, any places mentioned in the book? Okay. So those are the things that I want you to identify in step 1. And again, those questions that I give you in that table are just serve as a guide. You don't have to answer every single one. Okay. And again, I'll show you an example from Luke here in a minute. The second step is then to identify the literary context of the book. All right. Now, this is a little different. The background context is sort of the setting of the book. The literary context is what was actually written in the book. And so it's piecing together each of those sections of the book. And in this case, like for Jonah, for example, the literary context, you'd have chapter 1 was one particular story, chapter 2 was another, chapter 3, and then chapter 4. And so you would summarize each of those chapters. What seems to be the main thought or idea or event taking place in each of those chapters. And so we want to do that for the entire book. Now, basically, because the gospel is so big, there's so many chapters, an outline would be okay for this particular step. And again, I'll show you the example that from Luke for that. And then finally, summarize the author's purpose for writing. Does the author tell us explicitly why he wrote the book? Now, in John's case, he does. So you have an explicit statement from that. Most books, the author doesn't, so you have to figure that out. But in John's case, he does. So you just need to state what is his specific purpose for writing. All right, so those are the 3 steps. I'll just show you the example from Luke. And by the way, I'll send this example to you again, so you have it. I'll put it on Facebook message. But here, I'm filling in each category: author, recipients, the social context, historical, etc. All right. So I'm going to identify any information about the biblical author. Now, Luke, there's a lot of details. So for the author, there's a lot of information. For John, you don't have to do this much. Okay. But in this particular book, which I've studied before, there was a lot of information about the author. So you're going to see an extended section on the author. All right. And I did actually look at some other resources when I did this. All right. So after I did my own study, so I incorporated some of that as well here. But I do indicate where I got it from. All right. So again, we're not going to go through all this. This just identifies the author from inside the book and from outside the book. Secondly, then the audience. Now, this is more about the amount of information that I'm expecting. Maybe 5 or 6 bullet points. Who is the audience? Who appears to be the audience? What clues are given in the book? And again, for John, he does identify a particular audience in his purpose statement toward the end of the book. All right. But also in John, there's a number of parenthetical statements John makes as he interprets particular Aramaic words. That gives you an indication of John's anticipated audience as well. There'll be times where it might say, like in chapter 1, it talks about Jesus being the Christ, and then in parentheses, or being the Christ, the anointed one, and in parentheses, John gives the Greek word for that, all right, or he gives an explanation. So that helps identify who he's also anticipating as part of the audience of his book. All right. Then you want to mention key locations. You don't have to give a lot of details, just identify places that are mentioned in the book. And then later, for your passage, you'll want to study that in more detail. The date of composition. When does it appear the book was written? Now, in John's case, he doesn't tell us a specific date, but there is some information that we can use to identify that. And again, when we talked about that a little bit in our first session together. So you can Find some there, information there. And then finally, the cultural context. That is, in what context did the author write? Who, understanding his audience, what do we know about that particular culture? And I give an example here from Luke you can look at. Okay, so I'm just asking you to fill in, 4, 5, 6 bullet points for each of these categories. Information. First, do your own reading on that, and then you can also add information from other places after you do your own study, okay? And do this for the Gospel of John. That's the book your passage is from. All right, so that's background context. That's the first step. Get information, who the author is, how do we know that? Is there anything from the book that gives us information about the author? And then sometimes, like I have information from some other resources about the author. But notice I put details from or about the author within the book. And then just some information there. All right, so you can look at this on your own. Second step, the literary context. Again, that's a summary of each story in the book. And like I said, because the Gospel of John is big, you can do an outline for this. Normally, I don't recommend that. I don't think outlines are as helpful, but just given the size of the story, it would take a long time to go through it on your own. So I'm saying you can shorten that a little bit by just using an outline. And I looked at the MacArthur Study Bible to help me give me an outline for the book of Luke here. And what I'm trying to do with this is you just want to know where your passage fits in the whole flow of the book. So if you're preaching from John chapter 4, you want to understand, how does John 4 tie into the other stories that are around it in the book? What story does it come after? What stories come after John 4? What stories come before John 4? So you want to have an idea of how your particular passage fits within the flow of the book. So that's the point of this step, is to understand the author's flow of thought and each story that he includes, where your story fits in. All right. And then, like I said, the third step is, after you've put that outline together for the book, is comment on how your passage fits in that flow of the book. And then the third step is, what is the author's purpose for writing? Now, Luke also gives his explicitly, so I write it down, and then I make a few comments about it as well. So just do that for John. Identify where he gives the purpose of writing a book and what he's trying to accomplish from his book. All right. So those are the 3 steps. It's the same format that you used before in your Jonah Ruth passage. And like I said, a lot of helpful information in the first session of our workshop together. Okay, and that's assignment number 1 for your John passage. Okay, any questions about that?
Pastor Tim, this
Yeah.
document here is available already for us, in the manual.
Yeah, I've provided it to you before, but I'll send it to you again, just
Okay.
in case you don't have it.
Is it available in Canvas, Pastor Tim, the
Yes,
TMAI Canvas?
it's available in your module 2 Canvas.
Module 2 Canvas. Okay, so
Yeah.
we'll just download it from there, no?
You can
If we
download it
need
from
it.
there. And like I said,
Yeah.
I'll send it to you by Facebook as well, just for your convenience.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you,
Sure,
Pastor
no
Tim.
problem at all. Let's see. In fact, maybe I can do that right now. Yeah, I'll just do that right now. Okay, any other questions about this first assignment? All right. Okay, well,
Mhm.
let's see, background. There we go. Okay, I just sent this file to you so you can have. All right, and so I didn't have you do the first step, but read and observe. But I'm expecting you're reading through the book just to get familiar with the book overall for John. Okay, and then next week we'll focus our attention on the narrative analysis of a passage. So I'll review with you again the format for basically the character and setting analysis. That's the first one. And that'll be just for your passage. This first assignment is for the book as a whole. The next assignment and all the following ones will just be for the passage you've been assigned. Okay. And
Okay.
some of you have already completed the background, the first assignment earlier. If you want to go back and review it, I would highly recommend that. And if you want to make some changes, you're welcome to do that and resubmit it. That would be perfectly fine. Okay. And next week we'll do more. I'll kind of come back to the review of the for diagramming that we were talking about that I started. All right, we'll do more of that next week, and also talk about assignment number 2, or any other questions or thoughts you guys have next week. Okay.
Okay.
Any final thoughts or comments? I know I'm sorry I did most of the talking today. I apologize for that, but next
okay,
week I promise I'll give you opportunity to help in our discussion, because I know you love to answer questions, different exercises. So give you a chance next week.
It's okay, Pastor Tim, because we are restarting, so
yeah, have to warm up.
We really need to get inputs from you, Pastor Tim.
Well, I think I've graded all your sermons, those of you completed them, and like I said, overall I was encouraged. So thank you for the effort that you men all put into that. And I know a couple of you are still working on getting yours done, so just get those done as soon as you can and send me the link, and I'll be happy to give you feedback on that for your first passage. And then let's build some momentum and get the second passage completed as well. Okay, so we can get started on poetry, module 3.
So, Pastor Tim, has vaccine? This is out of topic, Pastor Tim, but